Hi, thanks so much for joining me today. This is Dr. Richard Herbold, and I'd like to present to you today the process that I've been working on for 36 and a half years for helping people with chronic conditions. So my background is in functional neurology and clinical nutrition. And it's kind of a unique background, and the approach that I take is very commonly used through a company called Apex Energetics, and Apex Energetics is my parent company that I speak for and I teach for. And Datis Karazian, a good friend of mine, and myself, having similar credentials, talk about what we call a Neuro-Endocrine-Immune Approach. So we live in a world of specialty. So if you have a toenail problem, you go to a toenail doctor. If you have a thyroid problem, you go to a thyroid doctor. The reality of the situation is the body communicates in a web-like association, and everything affects everything. And we've lost that appreciation in the system we currently employ in medicine. So the neuroendocrine-immune approach that I take is based on looking at how the nervous system, neuro, how the endocrine system, the hormonal system, and how the immune system communicate. So if you were to take an example of diabetes, diabetes is typically treated from an endocrine perspective. And from an endocrine perspective, diabetes is regulated from an interventional perspective, looking at blood sugar regulation. And that's part of what we teach in my office. But just understand that you can have diabetes purely from an immune perspective. That's your primary issue. Now, the intervention also has to have that blood sugar component as a discussion. That's why when we blend everything together, the success rate goes up. But just understand that if you're treating it primarily from an endocrine perspective and missing the nuances of the immune component and the immune contributions, your success rate is going to go down significantly. So let's have an example of that. There is type 1 diabetes, which is juvenile diabetes, and type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition. So the body has decided to attack the pancreas at a very early stage, and there are a lot of different questions of why that occurs. So when the body loses its ability to distinguish self-tissue, such as in our pancreas, the islets of Langerhans, where we produce our insulin, when we lose that ability and we start attacking those cells, we prematurely break down those cells to the point where if it is an autoimmune condition and it has been left unregulated, we lose the capacity for producing insulin. Now, without using supplemental insulin, somebody with type 1 diabetes would die. Now, this type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition as an example. There's type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is very commonly found in the adult population. It's insulin resistance, which is a problem where your body has no longer responded well to the insulin you're producing, although you're still producing that insulin, but the cells themselves have become unable to use the insulin successfully. So what happens is the sugar starts building up and our ability to use the sugar becomes problematic and you become diabetic. There's type 1.5 diabetes, which is a nuance between the two, and now there's type 3 diabetes. Type 3 diabetes is actually qualified as Alzheimer's disease. So when we think about the brain, and that's part of my board certification as a neurologist, the brain depends on sugar and oxygen for survivability. So when we lose our ability to self-regulate our sugar metabolism and our oxygen availability, let's say you had anemia on top of that, what happens is we have premature aging of the brain, and oftentimes we qualify that as a neurodegenerative process. Now, let's face it, if you live long enough, and if you're lucky enough to do that, everybody will develop to a certain degree neurodegenerative changes, whether or not we qualify that as a diagnosis. So let's get back to the beginning. The beginning of the discussion was, how can we qualify a problem differently, which is what I do in the office? Well, looking at the NeuroEndocrineImmune Perspective, taking on a condition of acuteness or chronicity, typically more chronic and long-term, if we look at all the players and all the pieces, our success rate for helping from an interventional perspective goes up dramatically because we're looking at all the key players. So there are some core tenets in looking at this neuroendocrine-immune perspective that we always cover. We always review labs, we always do a physical diagnosis, we always do a neurological evaluation, and we look at the causal agents that oftentimes are missed. So when was the last time somebody sat down with you and really listened to the story of your personal health, especially if that frustrates you? Spending enough time, having enough insights, and looking at the history component is something in the current healthcare system that's woefully deficient. We spend that time. We do the physical exam, we review the labs, we qualify through laboratory evaluation, and we put it all together. So what I'd like you to embrace today is, if you're frustrated with a chronic or even an acute situation of healthcare, I can help you to at least quarterback the condition to see whether or not there's anything missing in your current healthcare program, and that's what I do. So I hope that was a helpful understanding or an explanation to understand a little bit more about who I am and what I do. This is Dr. Richard Herbold. Thank you for joining me at Capital District Vitality Center.